And you are Advaita Tantra teacher, and you're also the founder and director of Flowing Wakefulness and an artist. And you've helped many people to see their being, the oneness they are, that we all are, that everything is. And yeah, I think my first question is, what is the wakefulness? What is that oneness? What is that?
Oh well, it's. I hope my sounds, the ambient sounds, are not too much, because there is a rooster. It's a rooster, and this is his a rooster, and this is his hour. So he's being quite loud, but he'll calm down soon. He'll calm down. So this, so
Of nature. Oh, that's so cool.
yeah,
Yeah, fine.
and it's interesting because, you know, like starting with question like you just asked, and then there is a rooster. You know, it's almost you can, you know, what is oneness? You know, oneness. It's such a kind of obvious, but at the same time, such an incomprehensible, unfathomable concept, because anything that we can speak of, anything that we can communicate, would presuppose to have something which creates the possibility for this, what is taking place now. And that's already where oneness is being, as it were, somehow, somewhat sacrificed behind the scenes. Because in order for this conversation to take place, in order for any comprehension, any experience, any cognition to take place, this oneness undergoes this process of being rendered, as it were. So it's one, but it is immediately rendered into what now taking place as this possibility. So it already has this as you and me, as subject and object. And for you, it's in reverse. So this oneness, as soon as we begin to speak about it, we immediately run into danger for turning it into an object of our conversation, object of our thought, object of our comprehension. But oneness as such is beyond of all that. Oneness, if we are truly to give it justice in terms of what it stands, at least in English language, because of course we can begin to introduce many other terms which may be somehow culturally a little bit more specific, or a little bit more maybe acutely pointing to that. But English language is all we have at the moment, and it's a leading language in terms of global communication, whilst at the same time linguists say English language is not necessarily the best for spiritual, metaphysical, or even philosophical expositions, because the way the language has evolved, or maybe devolved, we don't know. So when you ask what does, the term oneness stands for me, right, or what it represents, I'm a little hesitant to immediately jump on the occasion and begin to speak about it in terms of how I would describe this oneness. So therefore it feels more fitting for me to step back and give this kind of a slight, maybe remark that whatever we will say about oneness, and again, that oneness would mean culturally for many different people, many different things in terms of the term that it stands for. Right? If one comes from a Hindu background, it may be one of the 1,000 names of Shiva, 1,000 names of Vishnu. If someone comes from a Sufi background, it will be that term which is always pronounced with reverence, the Allah, if we come from any other kind of perennial tradition or particular religious background, then we will have a term that kind of stands there as a unifying principle, aspect, category, which reabsorbs everything into itself. Because if we speak about oneness just as oneness is a matter of fact, or oneness is all there is, and we kind of trying to describe it. So therefore, to me, before we even speak about it, it's always helpful to get that reminder that we can never speak about that, what is essentially is all there is, in terms of objectifying it into a subject of our conversation, because that what stands here as oneness is sacrificed so that this, what now takes place, can take place.
Yeah, it's like existence, because everyone, we all know, like I know I exist because I'm here, I do exist. I may not know what I exist as or who I am existing as, but I know for sure there is existence. And that's the same for everybody. And it's like that. It's unknown though, right? And as you say, it's hard to put any words onto it because it's before the word, it's before the anything, or it's with it, it's one with it too. That's the thing, oneness is one with everything. So yeah.
Yes, exactly. That existence here perhaps most accurately represented by that now very helpful English term being, or beingness. That existence, that the fact that we may be lost in whatever concepts, we may be lost in life in terms of our identity, in terms of our belonging, in terms of whether we're coming or going, but the mere fact that we're here experiencing this, whatever that is the marvel and the mystery, and spoken of also as that what is given. So that existence, that beingness, is prior to everything that we can then speak of, articulate, or just confess to utter inability to venture there, because for a lot of people, this sense of beingness is the most intimate, and yet, at the very same time, the most incomprehensible concept, the most incomprehensible idea to carry. So that paradox here is, I think, is very, very valid in terms of unfoldment of any spiritual discourse, dialogue, because it positions one right here, right now, in terms of one's own essence, which is all there is, and also because it's not something that is taking place in time. It's not taking place even, it's not even taking place in terms of spatial dimension. It's actually an experience for which we do not have any valid way to articulate this, because that sense of beingness is all there is, irrespective of where we have found ourselves in lives. And this is one of the bizarre things about human experience now. Let's say as we all age or undergo transformation, which is physical, visceral in terms of how we are no longer how we used to be. But that sense of beingness has always been there with us. It is with every child, with every toddler, with every newborn, with every teenager. And it remains being there. We do not know the state of people who consider being lost to consciousness, in the sense they're no longer able to communicate their state of affairs. I'm talking about some extreme examples of losing it all. And yet, if we have had access to that, we don't, but if, let's say, then I'm almost certain that that same sense of beingness is there.
Yeah, and like the rooster in the background, right? It's also being a rooster, and we are human beings, and it's beautiful. Like it's wonderful to hear this rooster. It's wonderful to speak with you, and so it's all this that happens in this oneness and is in this being, and that has so much beauty because there's interaction in between all these many that is actually one, right? But so like the wakefulness, is that what you wake up to when you realize, oh, I'm not this separate self, but I'm actually this interconnected, and it's the being that's with all this interconnectedness, one with it, and like what do you, is that the wakefulness, the flowing wakefulness, for example? It's a flow as well. It's never static. It's
well, the combination of words and the terms themselves, they are kind of very very close to me, simply because on one hand it's the most direct experience of that what became very apparent state of affairs some years ago, and that was quite some times ago, and also because of its direct association with how my own teacher, Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, when he did the gloss on some of the principal aspects of the Vedic wisdom, and these four Vedas, Rig Ved, Samved, Yajur Ved, and Atharva Ved, four principal Vedas, from where all the Vedic wisdom streams, as it were, these are the principal ones. The second Veda spoken of as often, second, Sama Veda, is being described by Maharishi as flowing wakefulness, because this Sama Veda corresponds to the sensory perception, sensory organs, sense perception. So it has this deeply, for me personally, deep connotations to the essence of the tantric teachings, because Tantra is unapologetically here, experiencing life, being in this world. It's not something that is being considered as a appearance in awareness, as a mirage, or just as that Maya, something, and then it's gone. Instead, and this is where, just not to take us too much into that scholarly ramifications of the parallels which run as two, or rather like two embankments of the same river, in as far as the Hindu culture is concerned, as far as that Vedic culture and as far as that Vedic civilization is concerned, have always run in parallel, always have been this one which is a complete negation, and that which has this all-encompassing aspect. So Tantra is all-encompassing. So this Tantric perspective views the world nothing other than the very body of awareness. So awareness is not stands in opposition to the world, nor is it aloof from the world. So this is some of the key principal aspects of what sets Tantra apart. And of course there are dualistic Tantras as well as non-dual Tantras. But in essence, Tantric perspective has this pro-life, pro-experience, pro-existence attitude from get-going. So flowing wakefulness, it's also kind of a last line in one of my verses that came to me when I went through a phase of writing poetry. a very short phase, maybe just 2 years, but one of the verses ends with that, Flowing Wakefulness. I will share it with you later on. So Flowing Wakefulness here gained that dimension that indeed, as you have pointed out, flowing, it means it's not something which is crystallized, it's not a set of ideas, a set of concepts, but it's something which is continuously in a stream of its own awareness, awake to itself. So that wakefulness is a very quality of awareness. That wakefulness on the go, on the move. So flowing wakefulness means it's not something that one arrives as a set of understanding, but it's rather a very juicy, wet, very tactile, tangible affair of what it represents. So I thought, well, one day it's a very fitting combination of words for organization, fellowship, and just something that stood out for me, and then it took life of its own. So that's in relation to that what flowing wakefulness really represents. But I know that your question also had that what it means maybe to me and personally, that wakefulness is something which is characterized very much by seamlessness of that which is always there, and it only appears at some point that it's not. And that kind of extraordinary sport that consciousness plays with itself is where we at some point experiencing going through life as if lost to that, as if bereft to that what actually illumines all this in the first place. So that wakefulness here, of course, is yet another term that, in my view, quite closely resonates or reverberates with the very essence of that realization, that it's awake to itself. Wakefulness. So it's awake to itself. It's not awake for you or for me, but it's awake to itself, and therefore you and I, we have this simultaneity of that experiencing ourselves as so and so, but at the very same time we are awake as that wakefulness. And this is also often when people ask, how does it feel? When people are curious, and what is it like to realize one's essence? And very often it feels fitting to say that it may be a spectacular in its accompanying phenomena, but the underlying innate insight is that how it always is. So in other words, it's almost as if something was forgotten, and then, oh, here you are, it presents itself, and it's a great relief. It's like this great 10th century Kashmir Shaivism sage, Abhinavagupta. He said that self-realization could also be spoken in terms of suddenly putting a very heavy load that one was carrying down, and that sense of relief, that is a very, very apt metaphor. And at the same time, that remembering, recognizing suddenly that what always nothing other than is what this whole thing is about. So it's not something added into us, not something that is developed, not something that is even cultured, even though we can speak about it in these terms, of course. But the obviousness, immediacy, and the underlying sense of that is what I think the term wakefulness here carries, and therefore I thought it's a fitting term to use.
Yeah. And so I noticed, for example, you have a Kundalini course on your website, right? And so what is Kundalini, and how does that relate to this very immediate, obvious, simple being that we are? Like sometimes it feels like there is a journey, or there is a, but then there's not, because this is who I am, and I'm appearing like this in this life, in this world, and I just am. I'm already divine or full, or no fear, peace, whatever. So sometimes it feels like, oh, I should do this, or I should practice that, meditate. I should, for example, awake my Kundalini, or what is that about?
Well, it's a very big topic. That's why the course, it's the largest course we've offered as an organization. It has been 3 months in terms of exposition, and contains many modules, many hours of pre-recorded as well as live interactions. In fact, we just completed the course actually last weekend. It was the last live Q&A, and I was speaking there candidly that the very nature, the topic of the course is something that I've carried with me for as long as I really recall myself, because something that has always been in the background. So, but for, just to give it maybe a very quick reference on how to position this in this format of conversation, because Kundalini enjoys a lot of ambivalent, I would say, reputation in today's spirituality, and not just spirituality, but in today's world at large, even in India, in a country where that term itself is indispensable from. But to make it very simple, Kundalini, if we are to speak about it from where the very term itself coming from, and the term itself coming from the very early Shaivites, those who are at the origin of all forms of yoga known to us today. So these early Shaivites, they came up with this term, and the term Kundalini represents consciousness coiled to itself. So Kundalini is nothing other than what we consider ourselves to be, whilst Kundalini is in a state of homeostasis. So a lot of very big figures in spirituality of the last 100 years spoke about Kundalini, of course. At some point, there was both. On one hand, there was this great renaissance and revival. The Kundalini itself enjoys, as a term, now I'm speaking, Kundalini as a term which entered Western languages. It has a history. It's very, very interesting to trace how and when Kundalini became figuring in various discourses, circles, scholarly pursuits, and so forth. Most commonly, of course, Kundalini was brought to the West by the legendary Paramahamsa Yogananda, who was considered to be one of the very first Indian teachers, right? Indian yogis who have traveled to the West and spoke at the, I forgot, was it a congress or something like that, of different religions. And before that was Swami Vivekananda, but it is Paramahamsa Yogananda who is credited with really introducing the American public to quite some depth of these teachings, which prior to that probably never left India. We know that I used to go a lot to California, and there is a beautiful center still in between Santa Monica and Malibu, which is the place which he has built, which was his spiritual center. It's a greatly venerated figure, but we can find allusions to Kundalini, and when he spoke about that, even that documentary that came out a few years ago, Awake, the life of Paramahamsa Yogananda, there was this term from his book, the famous autobiography of a yogi, path to God in one's own spine, something like that. In sort of like, at that time it was a groundbreaking, revolutionary perspective, because with all the amount of spiritual circles and societies that proliferated at the time, there was no shortage in spiritual pursuits. But here there was this almost direct remark, or direct putting it plainly, straightforwardly, that God, or as that what stands here for what we're speaking as oneness, that unity, that awareness, that consciousness, is attained nowhere but within one's own reality. And the path to God is through the spine. So that line even figures in that Awake series. But of course, a lot has happened since then. Then in the 30s, Carl Jung introduced his seminars on Kundalini, which are published by Shambhala today, and it's a very venerated account among the scholars because it gave oomph and it gives depth to the rapidly developing schools of psychology. It is not at all a secret that without Carl Jung's interest in Tantra, and Carl Jung's interest in particular into this very, very lesser accessible tantric teachings that gave a solid platform to what we know today as transpersonal psychology. All these archetypes, all this self-analysis, psychoanalysis is impossible without Jung taking the level of psychological inquiry to such degree. But Kundalini, of course, goes way beyond that. And then there were very large, important figures in the West later on who popularized and brought the term into every household. People like Swami Muktananda, the founder of Siddha Yoga, global international organization. Later on, another teacher came from India who kind of was self-appointed and built a great empire known today as Kundalini Yoga, which was mostly a combination of special exercises to harness that energy. So that there are split of opinions whether this was actually actually brings the awakening of Kundalini as such. But to narrow it all down now, to make it accessible for listeners, for the audience, Kundalini is not some exotic concept pertinent to Indian culture. Kundalini is, we can speak about it as life force in the body. And life force in the body here is nothing other than what the Sanskrit term Atma stands for. Atma. Atma is a term for soul, but it has extra dimension to it in terms of how it's used in Indian philosophy. And that famous thesis, Atma is Brahman. In other words, individual is absolute. So Atma is that how consciousness experiencing willingly this individual existence, and that's what Kundalini is. So often in my discourses, going back many years ago, I came out to teach at the time when non-duality was still enjoying its golden, maybe last kind of golden years, and maybe the sunset of non-duality, because there was a lot of beliefs that people can partake in satsangs and listen and hear enough about this for it to become a lived reality. But even when today among the peers, when we sit down together, often in private, and we speak about that, even those who brought the very term non-duality, who were some of the brightest stars of the 90s and, and later on, they all have realized that this will not cut. Different approaches required. So teachers who worth their salt, they went to develop other systems or approaches which would require incorporating that what conceals consciousness from itself, because that's what most people come up to and faced with. Because if the veil is torn and taken, then maybe some adjustments, reassurance is required, depending on how this unfolds in terms of psychosomatic quality of that process, in terms of the neurophysiological reality. If there's none of that to address, then there's nothing to talk about. The being then knows itself for what he or she is. So there is no need for satsang. There's no need for that constant dose of a reminder. But that is not the case with the majority of the satsang goers. So when I came out to teach, what I felt was lacking, whether this is a conferential setting or a setting of a retreat, where a lot of people were senior seekers, often much older than myself and have been at it for many, many decades, would come, and I would see that there is still a lack in understanding, lack in terms of what is actually taking place. So I began to speak about Kundalini. I began to speak about the importance of neurophysiological transformation of consciousness. That body here is not just some accident or some kind of nuisance to be seen through. Sometimes one can get an idea if one not fully goes into the classical Advaita Vedanta. Because even if one goes from that perspective, it's not all that straight cut. There are a lot of nuances, and Advaita Vedanta itself forms part of the whole unfoldment of the darshanas, 6 systems of Indian philosophy. So it cannot be viewed independently from what, let's say, being exposed and brought to light in previous systems like Nya or Vaisheshika, which is all about correct inference, all about building a proper foundation, which then culminates in yoga and karma, mimamsa, where yoga and samkhya, where the experiential nature of what is being brought to light via various spiritual insights is being verified, and vice versa. This is where the knowledge and experience hold hands all along, and that's what yoga and samkhya represent. So, and then comes this, what is known as karma mimamsa and Advaita Vedanta, the final pair. In the Advaita Vedanta, which is known as the end of knowledge, because it's the end of subject and object, it's the end of the division between the two. It's the end of known, sometimes spoken of, or the end of the Vedas, if we are to translate that literally. Advaita Vedanta. Vedanta is that. Vedanta, the end of Vedas. Postulated by 8th century Adi Shankara, it took India by storm, literally. And at the same time, there were other very extraordinary schools that thrived. Notoriously, the schools known today that gave rise to what collectively known today or popularly known today as Kashmir Shaivism, which often considered to be as the very creme de la creme of what India has to offer. It's a tantric teachings of extraordinary level of quality, that where the term beauty itself, which is also part of the very, very theme of your podcasts, of this particular one. Beauty itself is spoken by some of the principal sages as the very cherry on the cake of self-realization. So the world is not chucked out. Baby is never thrown with the bathtub. The world upon self-realization is where the juice of existence, and that filtering that juice, being able to extract that juice, is the very noble purpose of that whole enterprise. So the beauty as aesthetic rapture is one of the highest concepts of self-realization that ever came from any culture. So taking us all the way back, Kundalini is indispensable part of that whole realization, because Kundalini is very consciousness, which in the state of homeostasis gives rise to this idea of a separate self, and one enjoys that existence at the expense of, let's say, glory which is hidden beneath. So that glory, of course, can only be contemplated and understood intellectually. So therefore, the very goal of spiritual realization is inseparable from the unfoldment, full ascent, and total and complete taking over of that what Kundalini here represents, as that consciousness which regains its state of all-encompassing essence, only to take the body with it, because the phase of complete embodiment is known as the phase of integration or a return, which is just as important as the phase preceding that stage of the ascent. So again, one more attempt to make it as concise as possible. Kundalini, or rather, now we can take another stab at it. One's level of awareness, or one's level of consciousness, or even better, to the degree one is alive and awake to oneself, is measured by the degree of how active one's Kundalini is. So we can equate it that or another way. It doesn't really make any difference. So therefore, people used to come to me and ask this and present their dilemma, like, I've been on a yogic path, on this path of, let's say, Hatha Yoga, and they're completely different camps. There's a camp of those who practice yoga, and there are camps of those who so-called frequent satsang, the satsang movement. And these camps very rarely interact or overlap, just maybe few individuals, few people who may at some point migrate from one to another. So those are very interesting ones, because when they come and they present this dilemma, I've tried this, I've done these yogic exercises, I've done these yogic practices, to no much avail. And then I've realized that, this, and I started to listen to this teacher, that teacher. I started going to this retreat. I started sitting next to this teacher. And I could hear that, yes, all this makes total sense. And yet something in me also realizes that it's lacking that what I had in more that somatic experiencing or somatic approach, where neurophysiology is part and parcel of it. And this is where I would consider person ready to receive fully this teaching that I work with, and including the methodologies, approaches, and so forth, because they understand that it's never just a matter of intellectual or mental, no matter how brilliant, insight, nor is it a matter of constantly preparing the body, constantly making body ready for something, for some event. Because when awakening takes place, when Kundalini awakens, then the real deal begins. And if you come to my live programs, it has nothing to do with people sitting on chairs and listening a discourse. It's a very different affair. To begin with, we have mattresses laid around because it has to be cushioned. Yes, we do have discourses. There's always something for the mind to chew on, something to ponder. But the work unfolds and unrolls from that where really everything takes place. So people, they roll on these mats. When the stresses go out, they wail. When the stresses leave them, they begin to sing. They harmonize, they vocalize, they sing as angels. Or angels come down and sing through them, I don't know. They do bodily postures they've never done. Even if they've done many, many classes and hours of yoga, the body begins to perform these spontaneous yoga asanas, spontaneous mudras, spontaneous various different yogic locks, bandhas, and all this, of course, is known to us in yogic literature because some people at some point went through this firsthand, and the need maybe rose at one point to begin to narrow it down. But infinite is the number of asanas and postures that the body can take when the prana moves, expands, and begins to move the body in a spontaneous, involuntary manner. So that's in a nutshell.
Yeah, wow. Yeah, and it sounds also like it's very embodied. So it's like an embodied wakefulness that's in every cell, permeating every cell of your body, and also like a heart opening, like something opening.
Absolutely, it's a process which encompasses and includes the totality of being, not just a mental process. In fact, the real process can never take place at the mental level only. And the crash course in psychology will tell us that it's only a fraction of what is available to our mind in waking state of consciousness, to a conscious mind. A vast area of that unseen iceberg is comprised of subconscious and unconscious material. And it is there where all these psychic impressions, the so-called samskaric fields generated over lifetimes, that needs to be transcended, needs to be processed, so that what is self-evident can come forth and shines forth. And when it does, there's nothing to say about it, because it's obvious, it's self-evident. So it is a constant balancing act, because we cannot leave the body behind the process. It will immediately let itself known. In my work, I've at some point almost became known for being this like a therapist of a kind, in a sense of never really carrying that territory for myself. But I had a lot of cases of spiritual emergency coming to me straight from get-going, because people would not be able to find this guidance anywhere else, even among very well-known, highly respected teachers, because it's simply not somehow forming part of their teaching curriculum somehow. But in this work, it's almost like the first step is the last step. So you cannot leave your body behind. If that was the case, then we're almost in danger of jumping on that religious perspective that, don't worry about this life. When you die, you go to heaven. That's very, very unhelpful perspective. because it only happens whilst we are in the body. The whole point of self-realization, the whole purpose, and the whole beauty of it as well, is because it can take place whilst alive. That's what the concept of Jivan Mukta, that Sanskrit term, liberated whilst alive, Jivan Mukta. A lofty concept that came from Indian subcontinent.
Yeah, and that is beautiful. That is why you're alive. You can have this joy of the being of it is like a bliss and a warmth and love.
Yes, absolutely. It's not like bliss, it is bliss. It is bliss. Like the Upanishads declare, in bliss these creatures have been conceived. In bliss these creatures have been sustained. And into bliss these creatures should return. It's a very, very peculiar how our culture drifted, culture by large. We're speaking now about collectively held values, drifted so far away from the true meaning of happiness, which is experiencing that what is innate essence of who we are, which manifests as bliss. And instead, we settle for the reflective rays of that bliss in the form of pleasure. Because pleasure, of course, is tremendously important. Nobody will deny that. Part of the glory of being alive is to experience that pleasure. But we also know at the same time, if that becomes the driving, really, purpose, the raison d'etre, then that will turn into a sour affair very soon, because that's the very, very limitation of all pleasures. Like a clock, it reaches the 12, from there is only way down. This is the way it functions in us in terms of the way we're wired neurophysiologically. We cannot maintain that height of pleasure at all times. Experience has rise, reaches its peak, and then it subsides. So this is a kind of, it's not just a wishful thinking or some kind of a rosy perspective of some culture, but it's a great reminder to our present day culture, large global culture, reminder of the very, very value upon which life should be built. That value should supersede any outward evolution and development, because it doesn't lead us anywhere other to the dead end, which now we all kind of frankly experiencing and seeing, because there is no end to this continued going somewhere. If it's not experienced here and now, then we are doomed, no matter how preachy it may sound.
Yeah, and so it's like we are all full in ourselves. We are all bliss in ourselves, just in our existence. And then you could say the world and all the pleasures in the world and life is like icing on the cake. It's the cherry. it's yeah, it's. And it's like we are chasing all these pleasures and all these phenomena and forms as that being the ice, or as that being what is happiness. But the happiness is the peace you are made of, and then the peace, the bliss you're made of, and then all this that appears is wonderful, and it's but it's not who we are, and it's not there that we can find it. Like you said, we can keep going, and it will never get anywhere. So, but it's the peace in oneself first of all, right? Like rest there, and then everything else.
Yeah, totally. It's a primary. Yes, it's a primary. It's like adjusting it from, from adjusting it how it is, not how we may wish it to be. And this, everything, our education, health system, self-defense, everything has to come from that. Like I don't want to turn this conversation and change the topic into something else, but every sphere of our life and interaction is a result today of how everything is being turned upside down in terms of the values. So therefore, these teachings that started to come into our lives now in waves, wave upon wave, and these teachings are coming. They're already homegrown teachers in the West, and it's this subculture, that kind of small little units of that culture that is now developing, like in terms of in the words of that physicist David Bohm, who was a lifelong friend of Jiddu Krishnamurti, who wrote that book, Implicate Order, which made a great impact on me many years ago, like some 30 years ago, that in that implicate order, new life comes into being from this small little nucleus. And then they begin to merge. It's very difficult, it's imperceptible. It cannot be conceived from top down. Okay, now we're going to have a very good government, and that government will begin to take care of all the necessities, and suddenly this government is going to be the enlightened ruler kind of perspective. That is a wishful thinking, because government is a reflection. Every government, every governing body, every prime minister, king or queen, dictator or a president makes no difference. It's a result, an outcome of the collective state of affairs. It's a reflection of the consciousness of the nation at any given moment in time. So, therefore, in the words of Nisargadatta Maharaj, when he spoke about this, how can this be of value? He spoke about it in a very, very simple terms, that it's in the nature of consciousness. In the nature of consciousness, that if one is capable of changing oneself, one is already a whole entire universe. Pure subjectivity. Every human being is an entire universe, is a consciousness. It's not just some kind of unit. It's entirety of consciousness experiencing itself here and now. So if change takes place at that unit, perceived unit, so to speak, then the change happens in the entirety of the universe. So it's not happening anywhere locally. This is a misperception. And we now have quantum physicists who echo the very same conclusions that the Indian masters or Chinese masters or the ancient perennial tradition knew all along. That all this, therefore, this confidence, this audacity of coming with this declaration that the best way to save the world, the best way to assist in any transformation in the world can only come from a being who managed to transform themselves. Because that in itself already amounts for a transformed world. Because that being already emanates not just vibrations perceptible at this distance or that distance, because that's also not enough quite driving the truth home. But that being in itself already a possibility in consciousness actualized, And that possibility in consciousness actualized is conscious affair. So, of course, we can move from there to this very, very grand perspective that Vedic culture always operated with, which is encapsulated in the term dharma, that the most important concept, dharma, sometimes translated as vocation, duty, what one is called to do, but it's a field of action. Dharma is a field of action. It's all there is. So the whole purpose of all this is to sustain dharma, is to prop up, sustain dharma. So this grand perspective is how whenever dharma begins to get violated, whenever dharma is in decay, in danger somehow, to be maybe run into the direction where there is this, well, simply speaking, laws of nature are being violated one way or another. Just thought to mention that simply because we can speak about self-realization, awakening in deeply personal terms. And we can also speak about it in terms of what it represents from the standpoint of view of pure subjectivity. And this is very, very, well, a kernel aspect of the teaching that I myself feel privileged and blessed to communicate and to relate. So from that point of view, every human being is awareness, supreme awareness in disguise. So the transformation at that so-called individual level is nothing short of the grand cosmic universal affair. Not to get swelled by it, but that actual, if it's truly comprehended, if it's truly contemplated, what it actually represents, then the realization actually very humbling. It's a very humbling realization. Yes, yeah. It positions oneself, it can position one and heal oneself from a lot of idiosyncrasies and inherently held in a system traumas, inadequacies, limitations and lacks of all sorts. But at the very core of what it represents, it carries this possibility of consciousness to stand on its own and shine forth. And this is the time when it is the most needed, in my humble opinion. The most needed because we're trying to find, or rather in the world there are these desperate attempts for solutions to some or this or that problem, to this or that dilemma. All this is fine. I'm not talking about burying one's head into a sand and taking the attitude of none of that is happening. But what I'm rather reminding is that there is a possibility to introduce extraordinary changes by the changes that take place within at the conscious level, and then see what happens. So maybe I'll just pause it here because it's
and it sounds like, you know, you have peace within and then there's peace without. It's inside and outside. So it is everything out there in life and in the world is a reflection of the inside as well. And so I see you have to find the peace within before you can be peace out there.
That's very, very straightforward and very obvious. And it relates to that what we touched upon in terms of that concept of the field of action, that dharma, that very coveted concept that comes from Not just, it comes from Indian subcontinent, but it unites all Orient. The term Dharma is as important for all the Buddhist thought and traditions as it is important for all the Vedic traditions and Vedic rites. There is constant need to restore the lost sense of unity. And Dharma is that very, very field that suffers even on the account of the phases that we go through, kalpas, these yugas, the phases. So this, let's say, age we live in, which is also known as the age of ignorance or the age of unrighteousness, where that, you know, all that pretty straightforward. It's not just a new age concept. It's shared by many different cultures. So that, bearing in mind that laws of nature are not always manifest equally throughout different epochs, there comes a time when it is more apparent and more important than at others. And it is this time that we find ourselves in that is the most important, as they say. So therefore that concept of Dharma here, because the Dharma is suffering that phase, whatever the reason, we don't want to speculate or waste our breath on why that happened. Whatever, the fluctuation in consciousness and awareness, whatever there is, but this density of vibrations reached the degrees where this, what we're experiencing now, is the outcome of the world we live in. And that sense of separation, which begins with many of us feeling separate individuals, disconnected from each other and disconnected from, above all else, the core of who we are, is an outcome of that age we live in. Because in a more favorable times, this could be taken for granted. They say in more favorable times, so-called golden ages or in between, in Satya Yuga, there are no spiritual teachings, there are no religious practices, there are no and nothing needs to be done. Everyone, as it were, swims in that same waters of equanimity. No one violates, the part does not violate the whole, nor the whole violates the part. But in our day and age, this is far from truth, far from reality. So that's the concept also in terms of that peace within, peace without, but something else also is going on behind, beneath the affair of being human. And that's what I meant earlier when I said that awakening is only a prerequisite, because the awakening is what positions individual to stand independently as much as they could. Because up until we stand as consciousness, we always depend on that, how structurally we are fitting into something. Above all else, in terms of our identities, belongings, and so forth. And that contributes to fragmentation. That contributes to confusion.
It is time to finish. It's been a very long interview, and thank you so much. But all this information has been wonderful. Thank you. I really appreciate how you also talk about the importance of the body in the wakefulness, and because that can often be kind of not really prioritized at all. So thank you for that.
That's a great joy. I really enjoyed it, Susan. Thank you for inviting me. It's very sweet of you.
Yeah, thank you. And your website, what's your website so people can?
Well, it's just my name and family name, Igor Kufayev, .com or .org. Anything will do. So it's very easy to find. So we have just completed this Kundalini course, 3-month-long course, which we will have available in our online store. Since the lockdown and all these up and downs with traveling and pandemics, we had to do a lot to offer online programs. So we've been offering courses online since last summer. We have some other course on meditation called Samadhi, and Yoga of Integrity. It's a foundational course for understanding what are indispensable aspects for true spiritual unfoldment, called Yoga of Integrity. We have a free course online called Tantra Today. Anyone can partake it for free. And we just did our first live event in Germany finally, end of August, which was really, really enjoyable to be on the road again, to be with people, to be, because I've been traveling for the past 10 years non-stop, so it's kind of like missing that. So we're now planning our programs, but they're not announced yet, except that on September 25th, we will have online webinar. So everyone is welcome to join if they would like to. And so we will keep everyone updated.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Events. Thank you, Susan. Thank you.
I really appreciate it, and that you took your time, and it was nice to, because you have so much wisdom from the East, and it's nice to hear that in the way you spoke about it. It clarifies some things for me, so I really appreciate it, and I think it will for people who are listening also. So it will be a very interesting interview for people, and like I said, the body aspect. I'm happy that you also.
Yeah, it's great. Yeah, it's great to hear that. I don't know who other teachers will be, but the two samples that you have shared, the two links, I recognize some people that some of them I even have met over the years, like Ellen Emmett and Rupert Spear. I've known them since 2013. We used to see each other at the Science and Non-Duality conferences. So
I've gone there too.
Maybe that's why I thought you look familiar. Did you go to California or to Italy or?
Yeah. Actually, I went to the one in California.
So that's probably where I saw you, because when I looked at the web page, I thought that you look familiar.
Yeah, that could be. I've gone there a few times. And hopefully they'll start also again. It's a nice event. Sand, I like that. But they have some online, but it's more trauma based and focusing.
It's a very big now theme, trauma based, very big theme, like the Peter Levin and all that. This teacher from Austria, Thomas Hubel, they all they're very much about trauma. And well, I don't want to go there too much, but to me it's still the Gabor Mate. Gabor Mate. He has more of an interesting approach, in my view. And some people compared my work sometimes to Peter Levin, although it's impossible to compare at all, because what happens at my retreats is involuntarily. It's a byproduct. People begin to release stress. It's not because the purpose of gathering to relieve stress, or people begin to shake, vibrate. People begin to, like they sometimes, and especially in the early years, it was like my retreats were known for being like quite a demanding events. Like people come and they don't know what to expect.
Wild.
Very wild, totally.
But I know a little bit of authentic dancing or authentic movement. yeah, I've done a little bit myself where I just relax in my body and then it just starts moving and suddenly I'm like spinning around or shaking or something like that. Yeah. It just happens, right? And yeah, so I understand.
Yeah. Well, no, it's the authentic movement is not quite the same because the authentic movement belongs more to methodologies where, you know, like a lot of this induced and kind of invoked, where body can be tapped into this because this is all due to functioning of the parasympathetic and sympathetic parts of the nervous system. But the what happens in our programs is an actual activation of the pranic, all the pranic currents in the body. And because in my retreats there are many people who are going through quite advanced stages of Kundalini awakening. So there is a lot of that energy. You see, sort of when you go into that energy, even you don't need to do anything. You just sit down, and in no time you begin to vocalize, vibrate, shake, jump, or you know, it's inevitable because soon as you open up, or soon as one opens up, because of course you can sit like this and close in, also happens, you know. But soon as one opens up, then the field is very strong, and a lot of this, a lot of this. A lot of students from these very well-known teachers, you know, this is just between us, from Rupert and Muji, Adyashanti, you know, Byron Katie, they all come to me because they were with these teachers, and when the process began, they started looking out to, you know, like.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, so it seems like for people who seem very you know, aware of the being of oneness, they sometimes come to you also to kind of release or embody it. And
Well, no, it's as simple as that. It's like I worked with teachers who already were teaching, having their own retreats, YouTube channels, and that they did not know what's going on to them. You see, some of the students of Adyashanti who already went teaching, already giving interviews as teachers, but behind the scenes they were completely falling apart. They didn't know, because the process can be very demanding. Adyashanti went through a very, very demanding Kundalini awakening. But his tradition, where he comes from, doesn't have access to it, you see. So what I'm saying is that these people come to me anyway, because there are not that many teachers out there who can actually guide the very process. Therefore, this Kundalini course was almost, we could say, 10 years in conception. Certainly 2 years in the making.
Yeah.
So it's a vast, it's a monumental course. I mean, so
well, I'm interested now.
Yeah.
So maybe I'll check it out when
well, if you've been communicating with Tamadatta, who is one of my very close assistants of many years, you can ask him. You know, he will give you his also perspective, and he can also. Anyway.
Yeah, thank you so much, Igor. I really appreciate it. It's
joy, as the English say, the joy is all mine.
Yeah, good. I'm glad you had a good time too. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Susan.
I'll let you go. Yeah, thank you.
Okay.
And hopefully I'll see you live someday.
Sure. No, absolutely. Inshallah, as the Sufis say.
Yeah.
Okay.
We say that in Denmark. We say again.
Yeah. God's willing, or whatever, you know, if it's in the cards, if it's meant to. But set the intention and let it be carried by the waves. Okay.
Yeah. Thank you.
Okay. Bye for now.